The courthouse was already awake. Marcus Reynolds stepped through the heavy glass doors of Jackson County Courthouse, immediately hit by the controlled chaos that always defined Monday mornings in the legal world. The air was thick with the scent of old paper, burnt coffee, and stale cologne. Lawyers weaved through the corridors, their polished shoes clicking against the marble floors. Court clerks shuffled stacks of paperwork, their hushed conversations blending with the low murmur of waiting plaintiffs and defendants. Marcus had been here before, too many times. Not as a criminal, not as a victim, but as a businessman trapped in a legal dispute that had stretched on for months longer than it should have. A contract disagreement that should have been resolved in a conference room had instead become a full-blown court battle. And today was supposed to be the final hearing. Supposed to be. He adjusted the cuffs of his tailored navy purple suit, his brown leather briefcase tucked firmly under his arm. His tie was perfectly knotted, his posture straight. He knew the rules of the game. He had played them before. But there was always an unspoken rule, one they never said out loud but made sure you felt. He just hoped today wouldn't be one of those days. The check-in line moved fast. One by one, people stepped forward, handed over their paperwork, received a brief nod, and were waved through the double doors leading to their assigned courtrooms. Some walked in looking confident. Others moved with tight jaws and stiff shoulders, the weight of their cases pressing against them. Marcus stepped forward when it was his turn. The court officer at the desk, a broad-shouldered man with graying hair and tired eyes, barely glanced at his paperwork. "Name, Marcus Reynolds," he said, keeping his voice steady. The officer scanned his documents, flipping through the pages with a bored expression. But then something shifted. He hesitated, just for a second, but long enough. Marcus noticed it immediately. The officer cleared his throat and straightened his posture. "You need to wait over there." He gestured toward a row of metal benches against the far wall. Marcus frowned. "My hearing is set for 9 a.m. sharp. Everyone else is being sent in." The officer barely looked up. "You'll be called when they're ready." There was something about the way he said it, flat, final, dismissive, the kind of tone that told Marcus he wasn't going to win this argument. His instinct told him to push back, to demand an explanation, but he had been in enough rooms like this to know how quickly the wrong reaction could turn an inconvenience into something worse. So he nodded once, gathered his paperwork, and turned toward the benches. But as he sat down, his stomach tightened, because it only took a few minutes to realize who else was sitting there with him, and who wasn't. Marcus sat on the cold metal bench, his fingers lightly tapping against his briefcase. His eyes flicked toward the clock on the far wall. 8:47 a.m. Still early. Maybe this was just standard procedure. Maybe there was an administrative reason for the delay. But as the minutes ticked by, that assumption became harder to believe. He watched as a steady flow of people approached the check-in desk. Some were in business suits like him, others in more casual attire. Polo shirts, khakis, blouses. One by one they handed in their paperwork and were waved through in under 20 seconds. A middle-aged white man in a navy movable blazer and khakis stepped up. The same court officer who told Marcus to wait barely looked at his documents before nodding and gesturing him inside. Marcus clenched his jaw. A young blonde woman, no older than 25, approached next. She smiled politely as she handed over her folder. The officer returned the smile. An easy, almost automatic gesture, and waved her through without hesitation. 15 seconds. Marcus checked his watch again. 8:58 a.m. His hearing was set for 9 a.m. sharp. He had been sitting here for over 10 minutes, and no one had even glanced his way. Just then a voice broke his thoughts. "Excuse me, sir. Have they called your name yet?" Marcus turned. Sitting 2 seats down was an older black man, dressed in a brown suit. His face was lined with age, his temples graying, but his posture carried the weight of experience. He looked like someone who had spent a lifetime navigating courtrooms. Marcus shook his head. "No. They told me to wait out here." The man hummed, tapping a finger against the armrest. "What's your case?" "Business dispute," Marcus said simply. The man nodded, as if he had already known the answer. "I had a feeling." Marcus frowned. "What do you mean?" Before the man could respond, another person approached the check-in desk, a black woman in a red blazer holding a small folder. The officer barely looked up before muttering something under his breath and waving her toward the same benches. Same gesture. Same dismissal. Marcus' stomach tightened. He took in the scene around him. A pattern was emerging, one that was becoming impossible to ignore. The people being told to wait looked like him. The people being let in did not. Another 10 minutes passed, then 20. Marcus's grip tightened around his briefcase. At exactly 9:15 a.m., the heavy doors swung open again. A balding white man in an expensive charcoal suit rushed inside, muttering about being late. He barely slowed as he flashed his folder. "Courtroom B, right?" The officer nodded, lifted the rope for him. "Go on in, Mr. Hayes." Marcus shot up from his seat. "Excuse me." His voice was controlled, but firm. The officer looked up, clearly irritated. "What?" Marcus held up his paperwork. "I've been waiting for almost 45 minutes. What about me?" The officer sighed loudly, flipping through a pile of documents on his desk. Then, without even looking up, he muttered, "You'll be called when they're ready." Marcus' patience snapped. "You just let that man through without even checking his name." The officer's gaze finally met his. There was something behind those tired eyes. Something smug. Something dismissive. "You need to calm down, sir." Marcus clenched his jaw. Those weren't just words. That was a warning. And suddenly the courthouse felt suffocating. Marcus took a slow breath, steadying himself. He had been in too many situations like this, where the rules seemed to shift depending on who you were. He had learned long ago that pushing too hard, too fast, could turn a minor injustice into something much worse. But that didn't mean he wasn't keeping track. He leaned back against the cold metal bench, his gaze drifting toward the check-in desk. He needed to see it again, just to be sure. And within minutes, the pattern became undeniable. A young white man in a crisp polo shirt and khakis strolled up, his posture relaxed. He barely even stopped at the desk, just handed over his paperwork, and was waved through in under 10 seconds. Next, a woman in her 30s, blonde hair in a sleek bun, approached with a polite smile. The court officer looked up, met her gaze, exchanged a few words, and gestured her inside without hesitation. Marcus' fingers curled into a fist on his lap. Then, a black man, probably in his 40s, approached the desk. His suit was just as sharp as the others, his folder just as neatly prepared. But the moment the officer saw him, everything slowed down. The officer took his time flipping through the papers. His eyes scanned each page as if looking for a problem. Then, without even offering an explanation, he tilted his head toward the benches. "Wait over there." The man didn't argue. He just nodded, pressed his lips together and walked toward Marcus, taking a seat a few feet away. The tension in Marcus's chest grew tighter. And then, the final confirmation. A black woman, early 50s, dressed in a dark red blazer, walked up, clutching a small stack of papers. She placed them on the desk with precision, waiting for the usual nod. Instead, the officer muttered something under his breath and waved her toward the benches. The exact same wave. The exact same dismissal. She sighed, pressed her phone against her palm, and walked over to take a seat. But Marcus saw it. The way her jaw tightened. The way her fingers tensed around the edge of her folder. She knew. They all knew. This wasn't a coincidence. The officer at the desk wasn't just doing his job. He was choosing who moved forward and who didn't. Another 10 minutes passed. Then 20. Marcus' pulse throbbed against his temple. His hearing had been scheduled for 9 a.m. The clock now read 9:30 a.m., and he was still sitting there. And then, at exactly 9:32 a.m., the doors swung open again. A balding white man in an expensive charcoal suit hurried inside. His watch gleamed under the fluorescent lighting as he muttered to himself, "Damn traffic." He didn't stop. He barely broke stride as he held up a folder. "Courtroom B, right?" The officer barely looked up. "Go on in, Mr. Hayes." That was it. Marcus's heart pounded as he shot up from his seat. "Excuse me." His voice was sharper than before. The officer turned to him, face tightening with irritation. "What?" Marcus held up his paperwork, his fingers tightening around the folder. "I've been waiting for over 30 minutes. Why is he being let in without question?" The officer exhaled, flipping through his stack of papers like it was an inconvenience. "You'll be called when they're ready." Marcus's patience burned away. "You didn't even check his name." And this time, when the officer looked at him, it wasn't just irritation. It was control. "You need to calm down, sir." Marcus felt the weight of the words, the way they pressed down on him, not just a statement, but a warning. And suddenly the whole courthouse seemed to be watching. The tension was suffocating. Marcus could feel the weight of the courthouse pressing down on him. The air was thick, the kind of heavy silence that made every whisper sound louder. He wasn't the only one noticing. People on the benches shifted uncomfortably, some stealing glances in his direction, others pretending not to see. He knew how this worked. Push too hard and suddenly, you're the problem. But silence wasn't an option. He took a step forward, gripping his paperwork tighter. "I've been waiting for 45 minutes, he said, his voice steady but firm. "I checked in before that man." "You didn't even look at his name before letting him through." The court officer, Harris, leaned back in his chair, exhaling loudly like Marcus was wasting his time. "You'll be called when they're ready." That same line, over and over. Marcus tightened his jaw. That's not an answer. The murmurs in the hallway grew louder. The other people sitting on the benches, those who had also been told to wait, were paying attention now. Harris noticed too. His eyes flickered toward the growing audience before settling back on Marcus. His posture shifted slightly, like a man who wasn't used to being questioned, but knew he couldn't lose control. Instead, he used the next best tactic. "You need to calm down, sir." It wasn't just a suggestion, it was a warning. A dangerous one. Marcus felt a slow burn in his chest. He'd heard those words before, not to diffuse tension, but to control it, to shift blame. The moment he responded wrong, he would be labeled aggressive or disruptive. That was the game, and Harris expected him to play right into it. Marcus forced himself to take a slow breath. He wouldn't give him that satisfaction. Instead, he turned his head slightly, his eyes scanning the hallway, and then he asked the question that changed everything. "Are you telling me I'm the only one whose paperwork isn't ready?" Silence. Harris hesitated, and that was enough. Because now, everyone in the waiting area, every single person who had been told to sit and wait while others walked in freely, was looking at him. At Harris. At the desk. Someone in the back scoffed. A quiet, knowing sound. The energy in the hallway shifted. The tension wasn't just on Marcus anymore. Harris' jaw tightened. He opened his mouth, but before he could speak, the double doors at the end of the hall swung open, and a voice cut through the air. "Why is he still out here?" Everything stopped. Judge Victoria Lawson stood in the doorway, her black robe flowing behind her as she scanned the room. Her sharp gaze locked onto Marcus, then Harris. The courtroom was no longer in his control, and for the first time that morning Marcus saw something new in Harris' face. uncertainty. The entire hallway fell silent. Judge Victoria Lawson stood in the doorway, her piercing gaze moving from Marcus to Officer Harris, then sweeping across the room. The energy shifted, the murmurs stopped. Even the people who had been trying to mind their own business now sat up straighter, sensing that something was about to unfold. Marcus could see it. The way Harris tensed, his shoulders stiffening, his lips pressing into a tight line. He wasn't just annoyed anymore, he was cornered. Judge Lawson took a step forward, her black robe moving like a shadow behind her. "Mr. Reynolds," she said, her voice even but firm, "why are you still out here?" Marcus held up his paperwork. "I was told to wait, Your Honor." Lawson's brows knitted together as she turned to Harris. "By who?" Harris hesitated, just for a second, but it was long enough. Lawson extended her hand. "Give me his file." It wasn't a request. Harris had no choice. He reached for the stack of papers on his desk, flipping through them with exaggerated slowness, as if he still hoped to find a justification. But Marcus saw the way his hands twitched, the subtle movement of a man realizing that his excuses were running out. Finally, Harris handed over the file. Judge Lawson took it, flipping through the pages. The room was so quiet, Marcus could hear the paper rustling. 5 seconds. 10. Then her lips pressed into a thin line. She snapped the file shut. Her gaze lifted, and when she spoke again, her voice carried the kind of authority that made people listen. This was stamped and cleared over an hour ago. The silence was deafening. Marcus' pulse pounded. He wasn't surprised. He knew the truth before she even said it. But hearing it out loud, in front of an audience, made it real in a way that hit differently. Harris cleared his throat, forced a chuckle. "Must have been an oversight, Your Honor." "An oversight." Marcus clenched his jaw. He wanted to say something, to call it what it really was. But he knew the wrong words could flip the situation against him. Judge Lawson exhaled slowly, scanning the room. The people on the benches, the ones who had been waiting just like Marcus, were watching closely. Some of them knew exactly what was happening. Some of them had probably lived it before. Her voice cut through the air like a blade. An oversight. Harris nodded quickly, trying to regain control. "Yes, ma'am." Judge Lawson was not buying it. Her fingers tapped against the closed file. Then she looked straight at Marcus. "Mr. Reynolds, come with me." Marcus didn't hesitate. He grabbed his briefcase and walked toward the double doors, feeling the weight of every stare on his back. But just as he stepped inside, a voice, low and controlled, reached his ears. This isn't over. He didn't have to turn around to know who said it. And he knew, without a doubt, that whatever happened next would change everything. The moment Marcus stepped inside the courtroom, the shift in atmosphere hit him like a brick wall. Unlike the tense, controlled chaos of the hallway, the courtroom itself was structured, orderly. Power was in the air, thick and unmistakable. Rows of polished wooden benches lined the space, attorneys whispering in hushed tones while clerks scurried between desks. A bailiff stood at attention near the judge's bench, hands clasped in front of him like a statue. But all of that faded into the background as Judge Victoria Lawson strode toward her seat with a purpose that made the entire room straighten in their chairs. Marcus followed her, feeling the weight of every gaze shifting toward him. He knew what they were thinking. Who is this man? Why is the judge personally bringing him in? Lawson settled into her chair, adjusting the microphone in front of her, before leveling her gaze at the courtroom officer standing stiffly near the door. "Bailiff, please call the next case." The bailiff nodded, flipping open a file. "Case No. 24178, Reynolds v. Covington, Industries." Marcus exhaled slowly, adjusting his tie. Finally. His attorney, Greg Saunders, a sharp-dressed man in his early 50s, leaned over. "Everything good?" Marcus forced a small smile. Let's just get this over with. Across the room, the opposing counsel, the legal team for Covington Industries, settled into their seats. They were all dressed in matching grey suits, looking like they had walked straight out of a corporate law magazine. Their lead attorney, James Whitmore, sat back in his chair, lips curling into a smirk. Marcus recognized that smirk. It was the same expression men like Whitmore always wore, the quiet, patronizing confidence of someone who believed the system was already on their side. But just as the proceedings were about to begin, Judge Lawson raised a hand. The entire room stilled. Before we proceed, I need to address something. Marcus stiffened. He knew exactly where this was going. Lawson leaned forward slightly, resting her hands on the desk. Mr. Reynolds, it has come to my attention that you were made to wait outside for an extended period of time, despite your case being scheduled at 9 a.m. Is that correct? Marcus hesitated only for a second. Yes, Your Honor. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. A few attorneys glanced at each other, confused. Even Whitmore's smirk faltered slightly. Lawson turned to the bailiff. Officer Harris was responsible for check-ins this morning, correct? The bailiff nodded. Yes, ma'am. Lawson exhaled, nodding slowly. Then she turned her sharp gaze toward the courtroom doors. Officer Harris, step inside. The room fell into absolute silence. A few seconds later, the doors creaked open and Harris walked in. His stiff posture betrayed the nerves he was trying to hide. Lawson gestured toward the empty witness stand. Take a seat. Marcus's pulse quickened. This was not how courtroom proceedings usually went. Harris hesitated for a moment, then moved toward the stand, sitting with the stiffness of someone who sensed they had made a mistake, but still believed they could talk their way out of it. Lawson laced her fingers together. Tell me, Officer Harris, why was Mr. Reynolds told to wait outside? The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Officer Harris sat stiffly in the witness chair, his hands gripping the wooden armrests like they were the only thing keeping him steady. Beads of sweat had formed along his temple, but he kept his face locked in a neutral expression. Judge Victoria Lawson folded her hands, her gaze cold and unrelenting. I will ask you one more time, Officer Harris. Why was Mr. Reynolds told to wait outside, while others were allowed through without delay? Harris exhaled through his nose, his fingers twitching slightly. It was just standard procedure, Your Honor. A scoff echoed from the gallery, low but unmistakable. Marcus clenched his jaw. He had heard those words too many times before, used as a shield, an excuse. But today, they wouldn't work. Lawson's eyes narrowed. Standard procedure? She tapped a finger on the desk. That's interesting, because I personally checked his file, and it was cleared and stamped for court before he even arrived. So, I'll ask again. Why was he made to wait? Silence. Then, finally, Harris muttered, It wasn't personal. Marcus felt the energy in the room shift. That was it. The admission. Judge Lawson leaned forward slightly. Explain. Harris swallowed hard, glancing quickly toward James Whitmore, the lead attorney for Covington Industries. It was barely a flicker of movement, but Marcus caught it. So did Lawson. Were you instructed to delay Mr. Reynolds' case? Harris hesitated. His eyes darted between the judge, Marcus, and Whitmore. He knew he was trapped. Then, under the crushing weight of the silence, he cracked. Yes. The reaction was immediate. Murmurs turned into outright gasps. A woman in the gallery covered her mouth. A few attorneys exchanged sharp looks. The Covington Industries legal team shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Judge Lawson's lips pressed into a thin line. By who? Harris exhaled. One of the attorneys from Covington's legal team. They said it would be better if Mr. Reynolds' case was delayed a bit. Marcus turned his head slowly, his eyes locking onto Whitmore, whose face had lost its usual smug confidence. Lawson didn't look away from Harris. Name. Harris clenched his jaw. Whitmore. The room exploded. Whitmore shot up from his seat. "This is ridiculous. Your Honor, I have no idea what this man is talking about." Marcus stared at him, watching the crack spread in his usual polished demeanor. Judge Lawson let the moment hang before exhaling. "Officer Harris, you are relieved of duty, effective immediately, pending further investigation." Harris slumped slightly, his face pale. He knew his career was over. Lawson turned to Whitmore. "As for you, Mr. Whitmore, I will be filing a formal complaint with the State Bar for legal misconduct. Deliberately interfering with court proceedings is unacceptable, and you will answer for it." Whitmore's face twisted, but he didn't argue. There was nothing to say. Marcus exhaled. For the first time since he walked into the courthouse that morning, the weight in his chest felt lighter. The system had been forced to answer for itself. And maybe, just maybe, it wouldn't forget. Justice isn't just about the verdict, it's about the process. What happened to Marcus Reynolds wasn't an accident. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a deliberate abuse of power, a quiet but powerful reminder that not all obstacles are written in law. Some are enforced in silence. Marcus wasn't supposed to fight back. He was supposed to wait, to accept the treatment, to let it go like so many before him. But the moment he refused to be dismissed, the system was forced to answer for itself. And this time, it couldn't look away. But here's the reality. For every Marcus who speaks up, how many people are silenced before they even get the chance? How many names never make it into the record? How many people lose before the battle even begins? This story isn't just about Marcus. It's about the ones who never got their moment of justice. The ones who walked away because they had been conditioned to believe the fight wasn't worth it. If this story matters to you, if you believe that systems should be held accountable, that fairness shouldn't be a privilege but a right, then don't stay silent. Share this video, spread the message, because silence is what lets injustice keep happening. Drop a comment below. Have you ever witnessed or experienced something like this? Your story might help someone else find the courage to stand up. Subscribe and turn on notifications for more stories that challenge, expose, and inspire, because the fight for fairness doesn't end here. It starts with you.